Welcome to the second episode of the BMC Sport Science podcast. Thank you everyone for listening to the first episode. Today's podcast is about blood flow restriction training. Blood flow restriction training is a concept of training in strength and conditioning, with it slowly becoming increasingly popular over recent years. The training was initially developed in the 1960s in Japan and was formerly known as Katsu training. Blood flow restriction training, simply put, is a way of restricting blood flow in the veins of a working muscle in hopes to kickstart some larger gains in muscle size and strength, which is hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy is the increase in diameter of the muscle, as well as an increase of the protein content within the fibers. An increase in cross-sectional area of the muscle directly correlates with an increase in strength. Throughout this podcast, we will refer to blood flow restriction training as BFR. The BFR technique involves applying a tourniquet cuff to a limb, similar to what the doctor uses when taking blood from your arm, and pressurizing it with a tourniquet instrument to restrict, but not fully occlude, arterial blood flow into the limb during rehabilitative exercise. This allows the limbs that are being used during the workout to become engorged with blood. This specific type of venous occlusion aims to significantly increase the concentration lactate in your blood at lower workout intensity or weight. The aim is to stimulate the feeling of a much harder workout in the muscles, whilst also tricking the brain into thinking the body is performing a very difficult workout. This podcast will delve into its effects in sport and how it can be implemented into rehabilitation in trained and untrained athletes. So to start, John Joe, would you like to talk about how you can program this into strength and conditioning?
Yeah, so cheers for that little introduction, Luke. So just start talking about exercise load. Typically, a person's normally required to lift loads at or above 60% of their 1 rep max, and that's only to have noticeable increases in muscle size and strength. But with the application of blood flow restriction training, there's been plenty of research out there to show that anything from 20 to 40% of a person's 1 rep max, with obviously whilst training, you can elicit strength and hypertrophy gains. So that's a little background on the exercise load. Again, you can have loads of the pressure of the tourniquet, but we won't go too much into that because I think it varies a lot for different individuals, and there's a lot of limiting factors that go into that. So we won't worry too much about that. But I think as a general rule, 20 to 40% of someone's 1 rep max is definitely a good indicator of blood flow restriction. Just to move on to volume. Now, personally, I think this is quite excessive, but there's research out there to say that anything with 75 repetitions is a good rule of thumb. So that would be 75 reps over 4 sets. So typically that would look like 30 reps in the first set and then 15 across the last 3 sets. But again, another kind of way of training can be training to failure. I guess that's probably more practical for someone who's probably just come out of a rehab for post-surgery kind of thing. So maybe training to failure, it might be a little bit safer, because like I said, 75 reps, I think personally that's a bit excessive. I don't know if anyone else thinks that's probably a little bit too much. Rest periods, again, it probably depends on, again, how tight the tourniquet is. But as a rule of thumb, anything between 30 to 60 seconds, so a minute, that's interset rest periods. That can be, again, a golden rule. And then again, I'd say research is pretty varied on how, if we should keep the tourniquet on or if we should take it off. But I think typically it does say you can get away with taking it off, so you don't have to literally worry about keeping the tourniquet on throughout the whole kind of training. Frequency, I'd say, is anything 2 to 4 times per week. Again, there's plenty of research out there to say when it's implemented twice daily or 2 to 4 times per week, it can show strength gains. or again hypertrophy gains. And lastly, draining of training programs. I think that's a pretty limited thing in research. I know one of the papers I found pretty much said that most studies have only examined hypertrophy and strength adaptations anything below 3 weeks. So all training programs have just been 1 to 3 weeks. So it's hard to say whether it has any long-term adaptations, because personally I'd say anything 1 to 3 weeks is kind of just, it's pretty acute. So I guess it's kind of hard to say whether it does work in the long term, but I think just as a golden rule, everything I've said there is pretty good for someone who wants to try it to start with.
Yeah, thank you very much for that insight, John Joe. Lewis, are there any risks that you have found with this type of training?
Yeah, so the current research out there shows that there's quite a low risk with this type of training. However, some studies report that there are some muscle-related incidences when performing this, such as delayed onset muscle soreness. However, these generally come with exercise anyway, so these have been found to be independent to the BFR training. More reported effects of BFR includes dizziness, discomfort, and numbness. As such, due to this type of training that it is, as it restricts blood flow, there are some populations that are advised to stay away from this type of training. So these populations would be people with higher risk of blood clots, those with diabetes, obesity, and poor blood circulation, as this restriction of the blood may cause more serious health issues down the line. But I would say overall, the main disadvantage of this type of training at the minute is the accessibility of the actual equipment and how to perform it. This is due to it requires specific scientific equipment alongside a specific method to perform this safely, and there will need to be a trained practitioner there to set it up and oversee the entire session just to make sure it's all safe. However, I think because, as you said, it's a fairly new concept and it's got a lot of attention recently over the past years, I think over time it might become more accessible to athletes in the future, which would obviously counteract that main disadvantage of it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I believe, obviously, as it is becoming more popular as the months and years go on, definitely it would become more accessible. I'd completely agree with that. Thank you very much for that insight, Lewis. So Matt, if BFR is performed correctly, what are the benefits of using it, and particularly in untrained individuals?
Yeah, so BFR training, like it's been mentioned, is ideally used to replicate that hypertrophic benefits of obviously lifting heavy weights to failure, but instead you can lift very light weights in some cases, as John Joe correctly mentioned, 20 to 40% of your 1 rep max. So if you're a person that doesn't like lifting heavy, which may be found in more untrained individuals, then BFR training may be a useful alternative method in promoting or maintaining muscle mass. But also considering the times that we're in at the moment, we've obviously been in lockdown. Gyms aren't open, and people may only have access to, say, some light dumbbells or barbells that may not have the same benefit as lifting heavy, say. So if you are able to implement this BFR training into some movements, then it may open the door for you to have a better workout using them lighter weights. But ultimately, the idea behind the training is that it will accelerate that process of you reaching failure. So, for example, if you're doing, say, a bicep curl and you're using, 20% of your 1 rep max, then you may be able to do, 40, 50 plus reps pretty easy. You'll be going for you'll be going for a while. Now, if you add in BFR and you do the same exercise, all of a sudden you're bringing that rep range down, and therefore the time it will take you to reach that fatigue. So basically, it's just accelerating that fatigue aspect. But I think it's important to mention that, you know, this method of training, although it does offer the same hypertrophic effects as lifting heavy, it isn't actually any better. So if you are happy and enjoy lifting heavy, then do so. But like I mentioned, if you don't like lifting heavy or you can't lift heavy, say if you're injured or something, then this method again may be a useful alternative for you.
Yeah, some great points there, Matt. Thank you very much for that. John Joe, I believe you've delved into how BFR training can be incorporated into rehabilitation.
Yeah, so one study I looked at was by Hughes, I believe, and a few of his other colleagues. It basically looked into what is called passive blood flow restriction, or PBFR, we can refer it to. Essentially, all that is how we've all been talking about exercise. It's just applying it without any exercise. So let's say if we are talking about the Hughes article, they're specifically looking at people who have suffered an anterior cruciate ligament injury and have possibly had either surgery on that knee or are in getting to that rehab phase. So for people who are bed bound, it's actually been shown that it can offset muscle atrophy. Just a little definition of muscle atrophy is basically the opposite of muscular hypertrophy. It basically just means the loss of muscle. So obviously, if you've suffered an injury and you're in a cast for a while, you do notice that probably one leg's skinnier than the other. So that's just that muscle atrophy. And also you can lose strength during periods of bed rest. So essentially what this blood flow restriction can do, it can kind of reverse all of these negative effects on the muscle. And yeah, I think it's definitely something to look into for people who are bedbound and are looking for that kind of short-term kind of rehab, whether you call that rehab or if you just call it kind of just maintenance throughout injury. I think it's definitely worth looking into.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, John Joe. Matt, is there anything that you would like to add to the points that John Joe has just made about rehabilitation?
Yeah, so similar to John Joe's point, really, about you know, people that are injured, obviously they're unable to lift them higher loads. So I believe there was another study that used BFR training. I think it was from Hilden and colleagues in 2015, and it basically looked into 7 cases who were suffering with lower extremity injuries. And again, what they found was that BFR implications can again improve that muscular strength in those who are unable to perform them high resistance exercises. So like John Joe mentioned, people that are bed bound or are just starting out their rehab programs. But staying on topic of injuries and rehab, I think it's also important to look at the psychological effects that injuries may have on individuals. And, you know, granted that this may apply more to actual trained athletes, but you may also see it in, you know, you untrained individuals. And, you know, once you're recovering from an injury, that individual may become down or low in some cases, because say they can't lift the same load as they've done before. For example, say if you go to the gym and you can't lift the same weight, or even in everyday experiences such as, you know, carrying your food shopping. So if you are able to use BFR training in the gym or out walking during your rehab period, or even when you're bedbound, you know, it could have a massive psychological boost in feeling them similar hypertrophic adaptations again.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Matt. So Matt looked into the effects it can have on an untrained athlete. Jason, would you like to talk about the effects it can have on trained athletes?
Yeah, so thanks for that introduction, Luke. So I think I was pretty similar to most of the listeners here, and thinking that, like, when I first heard of blood flow restriction, I didn't really understand what it was. I was a bit like, I thought it was thinking of the effects of it. I thought, like, restricting your blood flow, it sounds a bit dangerous. So I thought that basically I could look into like trained athletes, professional athletes, because they have the top facilities, you know, they have the top practitioners in the game. So if this method is really like a serious method, then they're going to be using it because they have the optimal sort of like facilities and stuff like that, because they need to be, for the amount of money and stuff like that that's in the game, they need to be out on top of on the pitch as much as possible if they do suffer from injuries. So yeah, I've been looking at professional athletes basically to see like who's been using it. And what I did find that there's a man called Johnny Owens, and he's the chief physiotherapist at the Houston Rockets, the basketball team in America. And basically, he introduced blood flow restriction training to the team. Previously, he'd actually practiced it and used blood flow restriction training on rehabilitation in wounded soldiers. So that was in 2012. And so he joined Houston Rockets in 2014. And during the 2014-15 season, they had a player called Dwight Howard for the Houston Rockets. And basically, what happened to him was he kept suffering serious knee injuries, basically because he was jumping and landing. He said that basically he had a piece of cartilage in his knee that was causing him like discomfort. And I think he had to have an operation on it. And that led to him missing several games. So this man called Johnny Owens basically was the new physiotherapist at the Houston Rockets. He recommended that Dwight Howard should use blood flow restriction to heal the injury faster. And I think Dwight Howard basically, he just, you know, I think he was a bit skeptical at first, but he tried it. And basically what I've seen him doing was he basically had cuffs on the upper thigh, so the top of his legs, basically to restrict the blood flow down into his quadriceps, you know, his calves, his hamstrings, basically the muscles around the knee. What he did that for was to really try and get the same workout, like Matt said, reducing muscle atrophy and trying to get a good workout to maintain strength and also like for hypertrophy without actually putting a heavy load on his knee, which could have actually helped him in the healing process and didn't cause any further damage. And also I found that there's another team called the New Orleans Saints, and they were an American football team. Basically, they were using blood flow restriction training as well regularly to rehab injured players. A man called Bo Lowry, he was actually director of sports medicine at this New Orleans Saints. And basically he says that because of the increases in growth hormone and other hormone levels, even if a guy is like in a cast or immobilized from injury, they are able to create muscle hypertrophy. But there was something interesting actually from what he said. And he said that from some of the pressure that builds up during blood flow restriction training, that some of the athletes, and in particular the linesmen of the New Orleans Saints, are actually leaving them in tears from this training, which I thought was pretty interesting. You know, these big, strong guys like really like struggling from this more than they would during regular like resistance training. But I think that leads to a pretty important point actually, because for an athlete that's beginning blood flow restriction, if the first time you do it, you're just in tears, like that's not going to leave a good impression. Like you're not gonna want to do it again. A, because you didn't enjoy it. 2, because of the pain. So I think it could be like pretty damning to use it in that sort of way, as in to just go straight to it, because your body isn't used to a stimulus that it hasn't experienced before. And I think the body needs time, you know, to regulate itself to these new stimulus. So basically, I think that if you are going to use blood flow restriction training, that you should start off slow and steady and let your body get used to the effects, not just jumping straight in and, you know, like the Bolari is saying, is leaving the linesman in tears. I don't think that's a good way to start. Not just putting them off using it in the future, but you know, the body needs time to react to it. But just going back to a point I made earlier about Johnny Owens, he says that everyone's requirements to restrict blood flow is actually different, and that depends on like size, weight, strength levels, stuff like that. So he actually suggests that, you know, you need to use this practice clinically, because if you're just a lad and you want to go down the gym and think, oh yeah, this looks good, it's blood flow restriction training, and you're just tying resistance bands around your legs or something like that, it could actually be really dangerous for you. So he suggests that you seek the help of practitioners. And aside from the rehabilitation side of blood flow restriction, there's actually been some studies that have examined blood flow restriction on actual like sport-specific exercises. So initial studies, there was one called Yamanaka, by Yamanaka in 2012. He basically found that blood flow restriction in American football players actually increased muscular strength. So the same as resistance trainers who experienced like strength gains. He actually found that American football players were seeing this as well whilst training. Another study I looked at, this was very recently, this was by Kakak in last year, 2020. And he actually investigated soccer-specific training with blood flow restriction on physical performance in youth elite athletes. So basically, I had two groups, control group, one using blood flow restriction and one not using it. They actually analyze so soccer-specific drills, including passing and shooting, small-sided games, plyometrics, and continuous running. What was actually observed is larger improvements in the blood flow restriction group for muscular endurance, changes of direction, aerobic endurance, and the soccer-specific endurance. So he's actually shown that blood flow restriction training can actually be beneficial and enhance physical capabilities in youth athletes. The final study, there's a few studies actually on futsal. Those that don't know, it's basically indoor football, usually 5 or 6 or side. Basically, the same as the study by Kakak. The groups of players were split. One utilized blood flow restriction training, one didn't. And what they actually found, that once they completed a series of tests to assess anabolic hormones and leg strength, basically in the group that used blood flow restriction, there was actually found to be hormone increases, particularly in myostatin and IGF-1. And these results indicate that blood flow restriction training can actually induce greater neuromuscular benefits by increasing muscle activation and augmenting the hormonal response. So yeah, I think just going back to New Orleans Saints, Houston Rockets, when Dwight Howard was using this, he was actually, for his knee, when he had the cuffs on his upper thigh, he was actually doing leg extension. So I think that blood flow restriction training, particularly in the proliferation stage, where one of the main aims is to, you know, prevent muscle atrophy, regain strength as much as possible while limiting the load actually placed on the knee, can actually be really beneficial. And actual studies do show promising signs, but I do think that further research is required on the topic. And the lasting results of long-term studies are needed to understand this practice further. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Jason. Some great stuff on some top athletes and teams. We had some great research throughout on articles and stuff like that. Moving on, so Matt, as a personal trainer, would you incorporate BFR training into a program for one of your clients?
So obviously, first of all, I would get them to complete a PAR-Q assessment to identify if the individual has what we like to call red flags. So red flags are any issues that we need to refer them to a health professional. And I may even consult with a GP just to be absolutely clear that there are minimum risks. But to sort of go on from Jason's point about the American footballers who are in tears, if I was to program this into, say, a client's training program, then I would use what's called a tightness scale. Now this can be located on bodybuilding.com, but the rule of thumb is that the tourniquet is around a 6 to 7 tightness out of 10. Now, the problem with this method is that it can be quite subjective, with everyone having varied pain thresholds. For example, say my 7 will probably be different to, say, an SAS Soldier 7. But again, if I was to program it in, and I quote Lane on this, I would only program in isolation movements and not compound movements. This is because the pain, again, as Jason mentioned with the American footballers, the pain of using BFR can get too much to handle sometimes. Hence, it may become dangerous, and especially if you're doing compound lifting, say you're squatting or you're bench pressing, then their movements are dangerous in itself. So if you were to do it under BFR, then it would make it more dangerous. So I'd only program in isolation movements. But to conclude with what you've asked me, Luke, yeah, obviously it has its benefits to it, and it may have its place to be implemented into training programs, but it can't be treated as some sort of magic method where if I use this BFR training, I'm going to get these massive gains. Yes, it may have its place, but ultimately it is just one piece of the puzzle, with equal importance still on other variables such as sleep and nutrition still as important to get right.
Yeah, definitely. Completely agree with that. Thank you for that, Matt. It's great to have insight from a qualified PT on their opinions of the topic. Would anyone else like to add their opinion, or if they would use this for themselves?
Yeah, so, well, firstly, I'd like to thank Matt's dog for his input as well there. Really appreciated, Matt. No, but yeah, I think personally, I think if you are injured or you're in rehab, or you, for any reason, maybe you can't you don't want to put too much weight or on an injured limb or something like that, like you don't want to do heavy resistance training, I think blood flow restriction training can be beneficial, because you can still get the same benefits from just normal resistance training, but without endangering the whatever injured part or limb you have. Personally, I don't think there's any. I wouldn't use it if I wasn't, if I could do just normal resistance training, with heavy loads. I don't think there is a substitute for that. But maybe if I was injured, I'd think about using blood flow restriction training. Personally, I think I'd wait maybe until more longer term studies have come out to show the lasting effects of blood flow restriction training. But I think it's definitely promising, that some of the top athletes in America, Dwight Howard and the New Orleans Saints, that if they're using blood flow restriction training, then it's got to be safe, because they wouldn't be using it on their athletes, that's some of the most expensive in the world, assets to the clubs. I don't think they'd be using it if it wasn't safe. But then again, they do have the top facilities and stuff like that. So I think if you are going to use it, definitely seek out a practitioner of it, or someone who's qualified. But yeah, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there, Jace. I think you hit it on the head there. I think for me, if you're in the first 2 stages of injury, so that's inflammation and proliferation stages, and you can't physically do the traditional training regimes, I think it's a great way to gain strength in times where you'll be actually losing all your strength. And I think it's a great way to reduce the time it takes to come back from an injury, especially if you're an athlete who needs to play to keep fitness levels up, because that'll just take more time at the end after you've recovered from the injury. That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to reinforce kind of what everyone else has said, especially Jason and Matt, I think I'd only try it if I was able to seek that medical help. And I think that's a really, really important message that we need to get across, is that if you are going to try it, make sure you do seek that medical help first. Just because, again, like Matt said, with this tightness scale, we don't know what we're doing, and it could cause some harm. But I think if I was going to try it, I probably would try it, because jokingly, me and Matt were having a conversation the other day, and we were saying like, oh, we should just try it, see if you can get like massive biceps kind of thing. Like it would just be, I think it'd be a fun thing to try out. But obviously with that, don't see it as, oh, it's a bit of fun, let's take it as a joke. Like, do take it as seriously as possible.
Yeah, so just finish with my opinion on this. So I agree with the points that the lads have made upon their opinion. Kind of like Jason said, I'd only perform the training if more research had been conducted on it, and that would be with the help of a professional. If I was to try it, obviously initially it would have to be with a professional. But if I felt comfortable and had the equipment, I believe I'd only do it for rehabilitation. Because like Lewis said, as an athlete, it would be encouraging to perform this in order to basically speed up your recovery. But obviously resistance training is there, and I believe that, like I said before, if more research had been done, then I'd be more open to do so. But at the moment, I don't believe I would try it unless I was with a professional. So thank you all for your insight on this. And to conclude, just a bit of a disclaimer. As there is minimal research upon this type of training, as it's only attracted a large amount of attention in recent years, we are not encouraging you, as listeners, to attempt to try this, as there are several factors that need to be taken into account. It varies upon an individual's blood pressure, the length of their limb, and their pain threshold, like stated before. And furthermore, for this to be safe, as we've said, and we reiterate, the athlete or untrained individual must be accompanied by a professional at all times. So that's the end of this podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed and gained the knowledge on BFR training.